It was early December 2022 when I finally made the drive up to Ironwood. The road curved through the northern Michigan forest, miles of quiet trees and scattered old signs pointing toward long-forgotten logging trails. The leaves had already dropped. The sky had that steel gray color it gets before snow. I kept the heater in my old Ford running, but it still felt like the cold was creeping through the floorboards. I hadn't been up here in years. The last time I saw the place was in the fall of 2018. Back then, things were already tense between me and Lisa, but we were still trying, still holding on, even if it was just out of habit. We built that cabin together, back when we thought forever was real. We cleared the land ourselves, dug the foundation by hand. The frame took months to finish. She picked the dark green paint for the siding, said it reminded her of pine needles. After the divorce in 2020, I didn't want anything to do with the place. We agreed she could keep it. I gave up my half without a fight. I didn't even want to look at the pictures. I started over in Grand Rapids, took a job at a machine shop, rented a small apartment and kept to myself. Then last August, I got the call that Lisa had passed away. They said it was a hiking accident near Munising. Slipped off a rocky ledge and broke her neck. She'd been hiking alone. Her sister reached out to me a few weeks later. Lisa had left the cabin to me in her will. I didn't understand it, but there it was in writing. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe she didn't have anyone else who'd care about it. The sister didn't want it. No one did. She said I should just sell it or tear it down. She gave me the keys, the property documents, and that was the last time I heard from her. I didn't plan on going back, but something kept gnawing at me, especially after Halloween passed and the weather started changing. I don't know if it was grief, guilt, or just unfinished business, but I packed up a few things. Sleeping bag, canned food, a flashlight, some tools, and headed north. The road to the cabin was worse than I remembered. Overgrown and muddy in spots, even though there hadn't been much snow yet. The last half mile was completely washed out, so I had to park the truck off the side and hike in with my gear. The trail was quiet. No tire tracks, no footprints, just pine needles, bare branches, and dead silence. When I reached the cabin, it looked almost the same as before. Still green, still small and boxy, still tucked in between the trees like it was hiding. The front steps were crooked now, the porch sagged a little, and the windows had a yellow tint from dust and spiderwebs. The place looked like it had been forgotten, and it had. I stepped up onto the porch and unlocked the door. The air inside was sharp and dry, filled with the smell of wood and mildew. My boots echoed on the wooden floor as I walked in. Everything was right where I remembered it. The little table by the window, the iron stove in the corner, the bed we built from cedar logs. The coat rack by the door still had one of her old scarves hanging on it. I stood there for a long time without moving. My hands felt cold even with gloves on. I set down my pack and just listened. I didn't know what I expected to hear. Maybe birds outside, maybe a branch cracking, but there was nothing. The silence felt thick. I stayed that night just to see what it felt like. I lit a fire in the stove, rolled out my sleeping bag, and sat on the floor for hours staring at the wood grain in the walls. I didn't sleep much. The wind made the trees creak and groan all night long, and every time it shifted, the cabin would pop or knock in some corner. By morning, snow had started falling. Light at first, like powder floating sideways in the wind. I made coffee on a little propane burner and sat out on the porch. I thought maybe I'd head back, but when I looked out at the woods, I felt something different. I couldn't explain it. I wasn't ready to leave, so I stayed another day, then another. I started fixing little things, tightened up the hinges on the door, replaced a broken drawer in the kitchen. I found a toolbox in the back closet with her handwriting still on the lid. Lisa's tools. Inside was a hammer, a folding saw, a bag of screws, and a bunch of little items like hooks and nails. I don't know why, but I used only her tools for the repairs. On the third day, I found her old boots by the back door, caked with dried mud, laces stiff from time. I just stared at them for a while, not touching them. Something about them didn't sit right. They were lined up too perfectly, like someone had taken them off with care and placed them just so. That afternoon, I hiked a few miles down to the lake. The shoreline was frozen at the edges. I didn't see any animal tracks or human prints, just frozen mud and snow. The woods felt empty, but not in a peaceful way. More like something had cleared out, like everything living had moved on. That night, I heard something strange outside the cabin. It was late. The fire had burned low. I was lying in my sleeping bag when I heard a dull thump. Not loud, just enough to wake me up. I sat there in the dark for a minute, thinking maybe a chunk of snow had fallen from the roof. Then it happened again. Thump, this time closer. Against the wall, maybe. I got up and looked out the window. Nothing. Just darkness and flakes blowing sideways in the wind. I waited, breathing slow, trying not to make any noise. Another thump, this time near the back. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall. I shined the beam across the porch, along the trees, out into the path. Nothing moved. I walked around the side, boots crunching in the snow, and scanned the back. There were no tracks, no broken branches, no animals, just snow and trees and that heavy silence again. But when I came back inside, I noticed the boots had shifted. Not far, just a few inches, but they were no longer perfectly lined up like before. I stared at them for a long time. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in the chair by the window with the flashlight across my lap. The next morning, I found something else. Behind the cabin, near the edge of the trees, was a small pile of stacked rocks. Neat, about knee-high. I'd never seen it before. It wasn't there when we built the place, and I don't remember Lisa ever mentioning it. The stones were smooth and clean, even though everything else was wet and muddy. Something about the pile looked intentional, like a marker. I kicked one of the rocks loose just to see how it was balanced. It rolled off easily, like it hadn't been there long. Underneath, buried just beneath the dirt, I saw a piece of fabric. I knelt and brushed some soil away. It was old, faded red, looked like a part of a flannel shirt. There was a button still attached. I stood up fast and backed away from the pile. My breath came out hard in the cold air. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want the light to give away where I was. I kept the flashlight ready, didn't unpack my sleeping bag. I sat in the corner, back against the wall, listening. Around midnight, I heard movement outside. Not the wind this time, actual footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. Crunching in snow, then stopping. Then again. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. The steps moved from the back of the cabin around to the side. Then stopped again. Then silence. I sat there for 2 more hours without moving. Eventually, when the first gray light of morning crept through the trees, I opened the door and stepped out. No prints. The snow was smooth, undisturbed, like nothing had ever come through. But the boots inside were gone. I tore the place apart looking for them. Every room, every shelf. I even checked the crawl space under the cabin. Nothing, just cobwebs and frozen dirt. That was the last night I stayed. I packed up, left the rest behind, and hiked out without looking back. When I reached the truck, my hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys twice before I could start it. I drove all the way back to Grand Rapids without stopping. Didn't turn on the radio, didn't eat, just drove. It's been months now. I haven't told anyone what happened. Most days I convince myself I imagined it. that it was stress or grief or isolation. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think about those boots, how they were lined up, how they moved, how they vanished without a trace. I put the cabin up for sale in January. A guy from Chicago made an offer, said he wanted a quiet place to get away. I signed the papers and sent over the keys. He called once to ask if I left a stack of rocks behind the cabin. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. I haven't heard from him since. I don't usually talk about this part of my life. Even now, 10 years later, I still get this feeling in my stomach whenever I think about it. It's like a deep tightness, like I'm holding something down that wants to crawl its way back up. I wasn't some kid when it happened either. I was 32, a bit older than most guys trying to act like they're still in their 20s, but still young enough to think I was tougher than I really was. It was September of 2015, late in the month, when the air in northern Michigan starts to smell like burnt leaves and cold rain. I had taken a break from work. At the time, I was doing logistics for a warehouse near Grand Rapids, and I needed to get away from people for a bit. I just ended a long relationship and didn't want to sit in my apartment staring at the same old things that reminded me of her. A guy I used to work with, Jared, had told me years ago about a little cabin his uncle owned near a small town called Hebron, way up by Lake Michigan. Not on the lake, but more inland, tucked between patches of woods and abandoned farms. I'd never been there, but I remembered he mentioned it was right beside an old cemetery, like the kind that barely had a dozen headstones. I didn't care. I just wanted somewhere quiet where I wouldn't hear cars or phones or people complaining about their lives. Jared had moved to Ohio by then, but I still had his number. When I reached out, he told me his uncle had passed a while back, and the place hadn't been used since. He said it was still standing, though, and if I wanted to go up there for a few days, no one would stop me. He gave me directions, which I wrote down in a notebook, and that was that. I packed light, just a backpack with a few changes of clothes, a flashlight, a big hunting knife I kept under my bed, and some food, cans mostly, and a camp stove with propane. I brought water jugs too, since Jared had told me the plumbing there probably didn't work anymore. The place had no electricity, but I didn't mind that. I even liked the idea of using candles and lanterns. It felt like I'd be stepping out of the noise of life for a few days. The drive up took me about 5.5 hours. I left before sunrise so I could get there with enough daylight to look around. Once I got past Traverse City, the roads got narrower and lonelier. By the time I turned onto the dirt road that led toward the cabin, I hadn't seen another car for over an hour. That road was rough. My old Tacoma shook so hard I thought I was going to lose a tire. Trees grew right up along the edges, bending over like they were trying to block out the sun. It had rained recently, so there were muddy sections where the tires slid a bit. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches. The kind of road that makes you feel like you're going somewhere you're not supposed to be. Eventually, I saw the roof of the cabin through the trees. It wasn't much, just a square-shaped one-room place with a low metal roof, rusted in spots, and a small covered porch. The wood siding had gone gray, and moss had started to grow in patches, but it looked solid enough. Off to the left, past a clump of scrubby pine trees, I saw the edge of the cemetery. There were maybe 15 graves total. Some had headstones, others were just rocks pushed upright. A couple of them had crosses that had tipped sideways. Most of the stones had dates from the 1800s, though one or two were newer, 1950s or so. It was surrounded by a sagging wooden fence that probably didn't do much even when it was new. The grass was long, wild in places, but it didn't look like anyone had been buried there in a long time. I parked in front of the cabin, grabbed my gear, and let myself in. The door stuck a little, but it opened with a loud creak. Inside, it was dark and cool. Dust hung in the air, catching in the shafts of light that came through the single window on the front wall. There was an old iron stove in one corner, a wooden table with a couple of chairs, and a single bed frame without a mattress. A pile of firewood leaned against the far wall, dry and brittle looking. A shelf above the table held a few old jars and a couple of books with warped covers. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something else, maybe rodent droppings. I aired it out by propping the door open and lighting a stick of incense I found in my bag from who knows when. After sweeping the floor and shaking out an old wool blanket I'd brought, I set up my sleeping bag on the wooden bed frame. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. That first night was quiet. I sat on the porch, ate a can of beans cold, and watched the sun go down over the cemetery. There were no lights anywhere. No porch lights from neighbors, no passing cars, no planes overhead, just trees, wind, and silence. Once it got dark, I lit a candle and read a bit before crawling into the bag. I fell asleep listening to the wind rattling the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere out in the woods. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold. The inside of the cabin felt like a fridge. I made coffee with my camp stove outside, standing there in my jacket and boots, breathing steam. The cemetery looked different in the morning light. Less spooky, more forgotten. I walked around it reading the stones. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but a couple caught my eye. One was for a boy who died in 1893 at the age of 9. Another was for a man who died in 1911. The last name on both stones was the same, probably father and son. There were signs of animal activity in the cemetery, holes dug at the base of the stones, maybe by groundhogs or skunks. One cross had been chewed halfway through. I thought about taking a photo, but I didn't. Felt wrong, like taking pictures at a car crash. I spent the day hiking through the woods behind the cabin. There was an old trail that led up a low hill, and from the top I could see the thin line of Lake Michigan in the distance. I didn't see another person all day. No other cabins, no hunting blinds, nothing. Just trees and wind and sky. That night, something changed. I was in my sleeping bag again, drifting off, when I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I've heard plenty of raccoons, foxes, and even deer crashing through the brush. This was different. It was a steady crunch, slow and deliberate, like boots on gravel. Except there wasn't any gravel, just dirt and pine needles. I sat up, heart suddenly hammering in my chest. I didn't move for a while, just listened. The sound stopped. After a while, I figured it had to be a deer or maybe even a bear. Maybe I imagined it. But I didn't sleep well after that. I kept hearing little snaps and creaks. Every gust of wind against the cabin made me flinch. Around 3 a.m., I finally got up and lit a candle. I sat at the table and waited for the sun to come up. The next day, I looked around the cabin and the area outside. No tracks, no marks on the trees, nothing. Still, I didn't feel right. There was a tension in my chest that hadn't been there before. I spent the day closer to the cabin, chopping wood with an old axe I found under the porch. I needed to burn off some of the nerves. That evening, I made a fire in the small pit behind the cabin and cooked some canned chili. I stayed outside until it got too cold, then went in and double-checked the lock on the door. It was just a slide bolt, but it held firm. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, it was coming from behind the cabin. A soft tapping sound. Not scratching, tapping, like someone lightly knocking on the back wall with their knuckles. I froze. I didn't move for a long time. The candle flickered on the table beside me. I slowly reached for the knife and held it in my lap. The tapping stopped. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard footsteps again. Not running, just walking, deliberate, heavy steps. They circled around the cabin slowly. I could hear them outside the front now. Then silence. I blew out the candle and stayed still in the dark for hours. When the sun finally rose, I opened the door and stepped outside, eyes scanning the ground. I walked the full perimeter of the cabin. Still no footprints, no disturbed earth. The air smelled normal. The birds were chirping, but I couldn't explain what I heard. I knew something was off, and it wasn't just my mind. I've been scared before, real fear, not just anxiety. This was that. My body knew before my brain did. I felt watched. I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. Maybe I thought I'd prove to myself it was nothing. That last night, I didn't sleep. I stayed sitting at the table, knife on the wood, candle burning low. Just before dawn, I heard it again. Footsteps, coming from the cemetery this time. Not loud, but clear. One step at a time. Then something brushed against the front wall of the cabin, like a palm dragging slowly across the wood. That was enough. I waited until daylight, packed my bag in 5 minutes, and got the hell out of there. On my way down the dirt road, I stopped once at the edge of the woods. I looked back. The cabin was still there. The graveyard too. Nothing moved. Nothing followed me. But when I got home and unpacked, I found something in my bag that wasn't mine. Tucked into the outer pocket was a piece of cloth, old, brown with age, torn on the edges. It looked like part of a shirt or apron, and written on it, in what looked like faded ink, was a single word: stay. I never told Jared. I never went back, and I never will. I was 29 years old when I took a trip up into the Kaibab Plateau near Jacob Lake, Arizona, by myself. I had been living in Flagstaff for a few years after leaving a warehouse job down in Phoenix, and I was getting used to the slower, colder life in the mountains. My father had passed away the year before, and that loss hit harder than I expected. I felt stuck. I spent more time online than I should have, going down rabbit holes about native history, isolation, and desert myths. I was mostly broke, tired, and unsure of what I wanted out of my life anymore. I decided I'd clear my head with a week in a cabin my uncle used to own, a place I hadn't seen since I was a kid. It had sat empty for over 10 years, tucked away off a small forest road no one really used anymore. I got a cheap old map from a secondhand bookstore that still had the old logging trails drawn in. The cabin was north of the Grand Canyon, but far enough away from the viewpoints that no tourists ever came through. Even locals didn't bother. It was the second week of October. Snow hadn't started yet, but the nights were already dipping close to freezing. I packed up a cooler with sandwich meat, bread, trail mix, instant coffee, and canned beans. I brought my dog too, Diesel, a mutt mix of shepherd and lab, big and quiet. He was 7 then. I didn't have any guns, but I brought a hatchet, a long knife, and a folding camp shovel. I also packed up 2 flashlights, an old kerosene lantern, and extra fuel. I left my phone behind because there wasn't any signal up there anyway. It took about 4 hours to reach the base of the dirt road leading to the cabin. The last 20 miles were rough, rutted, muddy, and scattered with fallen branches, but I made it with my old Tacoma. I parked just off a bend near the dry creek bed and walked the last half-mile in. Diesel trotted ahead, ears up, tail low. The air felt colder once I was in the trees, and there was that smell, pine sap, rotting bark, and something older, drier, like dead grass and bones. The cabin was still standing, barely. The windows were boarded up, but some of the planks had peeled away. The front steps sagged. The door hung crooked. I had to shoulder it open with a loud crack. Inside, the air was dry and musty. Rat droppings lined the corners. Old cans sat rusted on the shelves. A mouse darted into the wall as soon as I stepped inside. Still, it was shelter. I swept it out, cleared a corner to set my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going in the rock-lined fireplace. Diesel curled up close to the warmth. I sat in silence, listening to the trees creak in the wind outside. The first night passed without much happening. I woke up once to Diesel growling low. It was around 3 in the morning. I sat up, flashlight in hand, but all I heard was wind and distant snapping branches. Probably elk or deer. I kept the flashlight on for a while, but eventually drifted back to sleep. The second day, I did some walking around the area, mostly following old game trails. I found rusted barbed wire running through the woods, marking old boundaries. Once, I thought I heard something up ahead on the trail, like slow footsteps, but I saw nothing. Diesel stayed close to my leg. He was more alert than usual. I brushed it off. Animals moved all the time in these forests. Bears were rare, and mountain lions usually avoided people. That night, though, something changed. It started with a smell. I had just finished eating and was sitting on the small wooden bench outside the cabin watching the last of the light fade through the trees. Diesel was laying next to me when he suddenly lifted his head, ears forward, nose twitching. Then I caught it too, something like wet fur and copper, like when you cut your hand and let the blood sit too long in a glove. Diesel stood up slowly, his back hair rising. I stood with him, scanning the trees. The wind had died. Total silence now. No crickets. No branches moving. Just stillness. Then I saw it. Just for a second. A tall shape behind a pine about 50 yards out. It leaned out slightly, enough for me to see a shoulder and part of a leg. It looked like a person.
Bare legs. No shirt.
I couldn't see the face, just a shape with 2 long limbs. Not crouched, but not standing fully upright either. It ducked behind the tree as soon as I spotted it. My heart kicked hard. I grabbed my hatchet and called Diesel quietly. He didn't move. He just stood there staring, stiff and locked. I picked up the flashlight, scanned the woods. Nothing now. I waited 15 minutes, then 30. Still nothing. Diesel eventually relaxed, but he wouldn't go near the tree line the rest of the night. I slept inside with the door barred. I shoved a log under the handle and moved a shelf against it. I kept the flashlight on all night, pointed at the windows. The next morning, I found bare footprints in the dirt. Human footprints.
Bare. No shoes.
The toes were wide, splayed. Some looked fresh. They circled the cabin, going from window to window. Diesel followed the trail with his nose but wouldn't bark. I walked the perimeter with the hatchet in one hand. About 30 yards out, I found a spot where the pine needles had been disturbed. Something had sat or crouched there for a long time, watching. A small pile of bones lay nearby, small animal bones, maybe rabbit or squirrel. They'd been picked clean. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I kept telling myself it was a local squatter, maybe high or mentally ill, maybe just a hiker who'd gotten lost and wandered down at night. But that didn't explain the way it moved, or the silence in the woods, or the stink. That afternoon, I tried to hike further out to see if there was any sign of campers, but I didn't find anything. No tire tracks.
No boot prints. No rapes.
The area was dead quiet. On the way back, I saw something hanging from a tree about 10 feet up. At first, I thought it was just bark, but when I got closer, I saw it was a strip of animal hide, dry, hair still on it, tied to the branch with a loop of twine. That night, the footsteps came again. I had just settled into the sleeping bag when Diesel growled. I killed the lantern and waited. Then the steps started slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. Then again, circling. I held my breath, my hand wrapped tight around the hatchet. Then I heard something even worse. Scratching. Just a light dragging sound across the front door, like nails or claws. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, like it wanted me to hear it. Diesel was trembling now, head down, tail tucked. I stood up, moved toward the door, and slammed my fist against it. "Go!" I yelled. "Get out of here!" Silence. Then something scraped against the side wall. High up, like it had climbed partway up and was dragging a hand or foot across the outside boards. The scratching went all the way to the back window. I stood frozen. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I packed everything. I tied the food up and tossed it in the truck. I was done. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to know. I just wanted to be far from it. As I was walking back toward the truck, though, I saw something that made me stop. Just behind the old shed, maybe 20 feet from the cabin, a pile of clothes, folded neatly, pants, a shirt, a belt, all dry, no blood, and next to it, bare footprints in the mud leading back into the woods. I don't remember the drive home. I just remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands hurt when I let go. Diesel didn't make a sound the whole way. I never reported it. What would I have said? That a naked guy lived in the trees behind my uncle's cabin? That he watched me at night and scratched at my walls? I didn't want to sound crazy. Over the years, I've read more about skinwalker stories. People always talk about shapeshifters, creatures wearing human skin, mimicking voices. I don't believe in that stuff, but I believe in people, twisted, broken people who go feral out there in the woods. People who lose their minds and become something else. Something wrong. That's what I saw. Not a demon. Not a ghost. Just a man who'd lived too long without speaking, wearing skins, eating raw meat, sleeping in trees. A man who had given up being human. That's what I think people mean when they say, skinwalker. Not a creature from a story, but someone who's shed the last layer of normal life. Someone who still walks on 2 feet but isn't like us anymore. I sold the truck a few months after I got back. I don't go camping anymore. Not alone. Not anywhere near that part of Arizona. I still wake up some nights and hear scratching in my head. I still remember the smell. And I still wonder, if I hadn't left when I did, if I had stayed just one more night, what would I have seen when I opened that door? Or worse, what would have come inside? It was early October of 2014 when I decided to take a break from everything. I had been working nonstop for almost 3 years as a mechanic in North Dakota, and between the long hours and the never-ending cold, I felt like I was becoming someone I didn't even recognize. I was 34, divorced for almost 2 years at that point, and felt like I was just passing time, not really living it. A guy I used to work with, Sean, had moved out to the eastern part of Oregon a few years earlier. We kept in touch here and there, mostly texts or the occasional photo of his hunting trips. He once told me he'd built a small off-grid cabin near Unity Lake, and it was his escape from everything. Just a one-room shack with a wood stove, no cell signal, no running water. Said it was quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by dense forest. That sounded exactly like what I needed. He gave me the okay to use the place for a week. Said he wasn't going to be out there until winter. Told me where to find the key. Under a stacked pile of firewood near the door. I took 2 weeks off work, loaded up my pickup truck, brought enough food, tools, clothes, and a couple of old paperbacks. Brought my .308 bolt action too, not to hunt, just for peace of mind. I left my phone in the glove box. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going, other than leaving a note in my apartment. I didn't want to be reached. That was the point. The drive from Bismarck to the cabin took 2 days. I slept in the truck off a rest area near Boise, then drove the rest of the way up into the hills near Unity Lake. The last stretch was a dirt road that went from bad to worse, winding deep into pine forest. I had to get out twice to move branches and rocks. Eventually, I found the small clearing, and there it was, just like in the photos Sean sent me. The cabin was maybe 20 feet by 15. Tin roof, small porch, chopped wood stacked neatly under a tarp, and a handmade door with a heavy iron handle. I parked the truck in a dry patch near some trees, got out, and just stood there listening. It was silent except for wind moving through pine needles and the faint creak of the trees swaying. The air smelled like earth, bark, and moss. No traffic, no voices, no humming of power lines, just woods. I found the key under the stacked firewood just like he said. Inside was exactly what I expected. Small but clean. A simple cot in the corner with a sleeping bag rolled up. A tiny wood stove in the center. A fold-out table with some tools and a coil lantern on it. A box of matches, some dry food in a metal bin. A rain barrel out back. I felt more relaxed after 30 minutes there than I had in months. That first day, I unpacked the truck, took a short hike around the area, and chopped a little wood. There was a small stream downhill about 200 yards away, and I filled up a jug with water to filter later. I made a fire inside and heated up a can of chili. That night, I sat out on the porch with a blanket and just listened to the woods. I could hear crickets and the occasional snap of branches. I felt safe. I felt alone in a good way. The second day, I walked deeper into the woods, following deer trails and old logging paths. The forest was thick. Tall pines, scattered underbrush, steep slopes in every direction. I found an old wooden fence that was mostly collapsed, like it once marked something but hadn't been touched in years. There was also the faint outline of what looked like a trail, although it was half covered in brush and leaves. I followed it for about 10 minutes and came to a second, smaller clearing with nothing in it but a large flat rock and some moss-covered stumps. Felt strangely quiet there. No birds, no wind. I didn't stay long. That night it rained. A steady, cold drizzle that turned into a harder downpour by midnight. I stayed inside, reading by lantern light and feeding the stove. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, just once, like a heavy thump outside the back wall of the cabin. I sat still, heart racing a bit. Could have been a tree limb falling, or maybe a deer. There was nothing else. I tried to ignore it. By the fourth day, I noticed little things, like the fact that I hadn't seen any animals. No squirrels, no birds, not even tracks in the soft earth near the stream. Normally, in the woods, you see something, a bird flying between trees, a rabbit darting, but it was like everything was gone. That made me uneasy. I also noticed something strange near the rain barrel. The ground behind it looked disturbed, like it had been dug and then filled back in. Patch maybe 3 feet long, 1 foot wide. The dirt was darker, less packed. Could have been an animal. Could have been nothing. I told myself not to overthink. That night, I heard the thump again. Same sound, like something hitting the cabin wall, but from lower down, near the baseboards. I didn't open the door. I sat still in my sleeping bag, rifle beside me, breathing shallow, listening. I didn't hear anything walk away, just that one heavy knock. On the 5th morning, I walked back toward the collapsed fence and followed the trail again. I went further this time, pushing past the thick undergrowth until I found something I hadn't seen before. A small, rusted metal sign nailed to a tree. The lettering was faded, but I could still read it. Survey Point 4A, 1978. Nearby was what looked like a half-buried steel pole, like it had once held a boundary marker or a cable. The area felt wrong. I left after 5 minutes. That night was the worst. Started around 11 p.m. I had just added more wood to the stove and lay back down when I heard something heavy snap in the woods. It was close, maybe 20 feet out. Then silence. I waited, heart pounding. Then something else, a dragging sound. Slow, steady, like someone pulling a tarp across the forest floor. Then again, the same hard thump against the cabin wall. I picked up my rifle and moved to the window, lifted the curtain just a bit. I saw nothing, just darkness and trees. No movement, but I could still hear it. Drag, thump, drag, thump. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with the rifle across my lap, staring at the door. Every sound made me twitch, the creaking wood, the wind gusts. I was shaking not from cold, but from something else. I knew someone was out there. In the morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. About 15 feet behind it, in the soft earth, I found drag marks. Something wide had been pulled through the dirt, leaving a clear trail that curved away from the cabin and into the woods. I followed it for maybe 50 yards before I found where it ended, near a large fallen log. And there, half buried in leaves and sticks, was something I will never forget. It was a small shovel, the kind used for backpacking or trenching. The handle was splintered, like it had broken from force, and next to it, barely visible, were 2 deep holes in the ground. Not fresh, maybe a week old, and something metallic sticking out of the dirt, like the edge of a can or container. I didn't touch it. I went back to the cabin, packed my things as fast as I could, and got in the truck. As I started the engine, I looked back one last time. In the distance, maybe 40 yards off, I saw a man, just standing, wearing dark clothes, maybe a hood. I couldn't see his face. He wasn't walking. He wasn't running. Just standing perfectly still, like he wanted me to see him now that I was leaving. I didn't stop. I reversed onto the narrow road and drove for 2 hours until I hit pavement again. My hands were shaking the whole time. I checked my mirrors every few minutes. I kept thinking about that shallow dirt patch behind the cabin, the drag marks, the shovel, and how I had seen 0 signs of wildlife for 6 days. I never went back. I never talked to Sean again either. I didn't want to know what that cabin had been used for. I didn't want to know who the man was. I didn't want to ask why the ground looked like it had been dug up. I just wanted to forget it. But even now, 11 years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, sweating, heart racing, thinking I hear that sound. Thump, drag, thump, and I know I was never supposed to be out there. It was the fall of 2012, and I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in Montana's Glacier Valley Reserve for nearly 5 months. I was 34 back then, not married, no kids, just me and my truck, a worn-out tent, and a head full of reasons to keep to myself. I'd taken the job mostly to get away from the city after a few rough years. A failed business, a failed relationship, debt stacking up. The ranger job barely paid the bills, but it gave me quiet and space, things I was craving. The Glacier Valley Reserve wasn't as popular as Yellowstone or Glacier National Park. This place was remote, full of old-growth pine, backcountry trails, and crumbling logging roads. A lot of people didn't even know it existed. The wildlife here kept their distance, and that suited me fine. There were bears, mountain lions, coyotes, and sometimes illegal hunters. My job mostly involved hiking trails, checking for downed trees, emptying trash from campsites, and making sure hikers signed in and out of the logbook. Mid-October rolled around and most of the summer staff had already left. The weather was getting colder. Snow was coming early that year. The supervisor, a guy named Don who lived closer to the base of the valley, told me I could stay up at one of the smaller outposts if I wanted, Cabin 3, about 6 miles northeast from base, near Hollow Creek. Cabin 3 wasn't used much. It was old, maybe built back in the 50s with a tin roof, a sagging porch, and no insulation to speak of. But it had a working wood stove, a cot, and was stocked with canned food, water jugs, batteries, lanterns, and some basic tools. Most people didn't like staying there because it sat by itself at the edge of the tree line, about a mile from the nearest trail. I figured the solitude would do me good. I'd hike in, hole up for a week or two, finish out the season, and head home for the holidays. I got there on a Tuesday afternoon, a gray sky already leaning heavy with snow. I parked my truck as far as I could on the logging road, then hiked the last half mile in with a backpack full of supplies, my .308 slung over one shoulder, and a thermos of coffee in my jacket pocket. It was quiet, real quiet, just wind and the crunch of pine needles under my boots. Cabin 3 looked about like I remembered it. The door creaked but held. The inside smelled like dust and wood smoke. I swept out some mice droppings, lit the wood stove, and unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot. Felt good to be alone again. No radio, no cell service, just the trees and the fire. I spent the first few days checking the trailheads nearby, logging down limbs and one rock slide that had closed off an unofficial hiking path. I filled out reports by hand and stacked them in the folder by the door. I cooked simple meals, mostly canned stew and instant coffee. The stove puffed warm air. At night, I'd sit outside in the cold with my thermos and watch the dark. But then, things started to feel off. The first thing was the footprints. It was Friday morning, early, and I stepped out to take a leak. There was frost on the grass, and I noticed prints in the frozen dirt near the back corner of the cabin. They weren't mine. They were from boots, standard tread, nothing fancy, but the pattern was wrong. Too small for mine, too fresh. They came out of the woods and stopped right at the back wall, then turned around and went back the same way. I looked around, thinking maybe a hiker had wandered too close. But the nearest trail was still almost a mile off. No one had signed into the trail register that week. I made a mental note and let it go. But then it happened again. 2 nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a thump outside. I wasn't dreaming. I'm a light sleeper. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch in my long johns and boots. The air was freezing. The woods were still. I panned the light around. Nothing. Then I noticed it again, the same footprints. This time coming from the same direction, stopping near the porch steps, then veering off to the left toward the creek. Still no voices, no engine noise, no signs of anyone camping nearby. I decided the next morning to follow the tracks as far as I could. I bundled up and took off around 10 a.m., rifle slung and boots laced tight. The snow had started falling overnight, a thin dusting, enough to keep the prints visible. I followed them down toward the creek, through a patch of thickets, and then into a dense pine grove about 200 yards away. That's where I found the remains of a fire. Ashes, half-burnt twigs, and a couple empty soup cans. Nothing fresh, but maybe a day or two old. There were no wrappers or gear, no sleeping bag or tarp. Whoever it was hadn't stayed long, or had cleaned up before leaving. I marked it on my map and hiked back. That night, I left the lantern burning low. My rifle stayed loaded beside the cot. 3 days later, I found the dead deer. It was early morning. I was checking the slope near marker 21A when I saw something lying about 20 feet off the trail. I pushed through some brush and saw the carcass. A young mule deer. Not a clean kill. Its legs were broken in weird directions, and its throat had been cut. Not ripped, cut, like with a knife.
No bullet wounds. No arrow.
I checked for predator marks but didn't find much. What really stuck out was that the eyes had been removed. Not eaten, cut out. Clean, surgical. That's when I started to feel it. Like someone was watching me. Every time I bent down to tie my boot or turned a corner in the trail, I felt it. That crawl of something just behind your shoulder. That tension in your neck that doesn't go away. I stopped sleeping well. I kept the fire burning longer. The lantern stayed lit through the night. I cleaned my rifle twice a day, even though I hadn't fired it. The feeling didn't go away. Then came the worst night. It was a Tuesday, about 1 a.m. I heard something on the porch. Not a thump this time. It was the slow creak of the wood planks, like someone walking one step at a time. I sat up, heart hammering. I didn't turn on the light. I just reached for the rifle and waited. Another creak, then silence. Then I heard the doorknob move, just slightly, just a tiny metal sound, like someone trying it real slow. I jumped up, aimed at the door, and shouted, instinct. But no one answered. I waited, counted to 60, then stepped forward and threw the door open. Nothing, but on the porch, dead center, was a small, empty tin can. The same brand from the fire pit I'd found. No note, no tracks this time, just the can. I stayed up the rest of the night. By morning, I made the decision to leave the cabin. My official time at the outpost wasn't up, but I had no way to contact Dawn, no radio range, and I wasn't going to stay another night. I packed my gear and headed out by 8 a.m.
He get fast.
Too fast. My pack bounced against my back, and I slipped more than once on the slope. The truck was where I left it, tires frosted, windshield covered in pine needles. I threw everything into the bed and got in. The truck wouldn't start. Dead battery. I don't know how. It had worked fine when I arrived, but now it wouldn't even click. I tried again. Nothing. I sat there, frozen fingers on the wheel. Then I looked up. At the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards back, a figure stood. Not moving, not waving, just watching. It was too far to make out features. Hooded maybe, or wearing a hat, but I knew it was a man. I didn't wait. I grabbed my rifle, my bag, and I started walking. 10 miles back to base. I didn't stop once. I made it by nightfall. My legs were shaking. I reported everything to Dawn. The prints, the deer, the can, the figure. Dawn didn't say much. He told me to go home early, that they'd look into it. I left the next morning. 2 weeks later, I got a call from another ranger who was sent to cabin 3 to follow up. He said the place was fine, no signs of anyone, but he did find something strange nailed to the inside of the woodshed door. Polaroid. It showed a photo of me standing by the creek. The photo had been taken from behind. I hadn't heard the shutter. I didn't know I was being watched. I never went back. They closed cabin 3 the following year. Too remote, they said. Too costly to maintain. I still work seasonal jobs sometimes, but never that deep in the woods. Not anymore. And every time I'm alone in the backcountry, I still think about that cabin and the man who was watching me. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take some time off work and spend a full week up north alone. I was 32 then, single, working long shifts in a warehouse just outside Bristol. I needed some space from people, noise, and everything that came with the city. My father had passed away earlier that year, and I'd been living in his old flat, clearing out his things, selling off boxes of stuff he never used, and going through what felt like endless paperwork. The grief hadn't really hit until months later, and I think part of me just wanted to sit somewhere quiet and finally feel something. Somewhere isolated, away from traffic, away from schedules. A friend of mine, Steve, who knew someone, gave me a number to call about renting a private cabin in Cumbria. The man who owned it wasn't officially renting it out, no listings online or anything, but he let me pay cash for the week.
No contracts.
I picked up the keys from a small post office in Keswick with a printed note in the envelope giving me the directions. The cabin was about 40 minutes west, past Derwent Water, deeper into the edge of the forest below Grike Ridge. There was no signal once I passed Lampla. That was fine. That was the point. The cabin was simple, just wood and stone, no frills. Small porch, one door, a couple of dusty windows. It sat in a clearing not much larger than a tennis court, surrounded on all sides by trees that went on forever. I couldn't see any other buildings or trails. No road either, just a long, bumpy dirt track that wound up and ended about 150 feet behind the cabin. I had to park there and carry in my food, water, and gear by foot. I brought a few essentials, mostly tins, bread, a small gas stove, and a portable solar charger just for my torch. There was no electricity, no plumbing. I had to use a bucket toilet that sat inside a little wooden outhouse about 20 feet to the right of the main door. I arrived just before sunset on a Sunday, unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place smelled like cold wood and dust. There was a single bed in the corner with an old wool blanket folded over it, a rusted stove with a narrow chimney, a small table and chair, and shelves holding matches, candles, and some cookware. There were hooks nailed into the walls where people must have hung coats or lanterns. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been used properly in years, but it felt sturdy and dry. That first night was peaceful. I lit a few candles, made a small dinner, and sat on the steps of the porch listening to the wind shift through the trees. It was dead quiet except for the occasional owl. I thought about my dad a bit. I remember wondering what he would have thought about this place. He used to like being in the woods when I was a kid. I went to bed early and slept like a rock. The next day, I woke up just after sunrise and took a walk. I followed the tree line west and eventually came across a small stream. The air smelled like wet leaves and soil, and everything was still damp from rain the night before. I spent most of the day exploring, not straying too far since I didn't have GPS. I took note of some moss-covered rocks and marked a few trees so I wouldn't lose my way back. I didn't see another soul the whole time, but that night things felt different. Not anything supernatural, just off. The wind had died down, but the woods seemed noisier in a strange way. I sat out on the porch again, wrapped in my coat, listening. It wasn't animals. It was like the woods were holding their breath between every sound, like the quiet itself was too loud. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something outside, a soft crunch, like someone stepping on twigs. I sat up in bed and just listened. Came again, closer, just 1 or 2 steps. Then nothing. I stayed still. My heart was beating fast, but I kept telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a fox. I didn't have a gun, just a camping knife and a small hatchet I kept by the door. After 5 or 10 minutes of silence, I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the clearing. I didn't see anything, no footprints, no broken branches. Still, I started to feel less relaxed and more on edge. That night, I kept the hatchet next to me. On Wednesday, I saw something that made my stomach twist. I'd gone to refill water from the stream again. I was walking back, maybe 20 yards from the clearing, when I looked up and saw something on the ridge. A man. He was standing perfectly still on a rocky outcrop above the tree line about 100 meters away. Just standing there, facing down toward the cabin. He wasn't moving at all.
No backpack, no gear.
Just a dark jacket and jeans. His hands were hanging by his sides. I stopped in my tracks and stared at him. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but the sun was behind him. I waved one hand up briefly, kind of as a reflex. No response. He didn't wave back, didn't move, just watched. I looked away for half a second as I shifted my footing, and when I looked back, he was gone. I scanned the whole ridge, but he'd vanished. I stood there for a full minute, just waiting to see if he'd come back into view. Nothing. I went back to the cabin faster than usual. I didn't run, but I walked hard. Once inside, I locked the door. The windows didn't have curtains, so I hung up one of my blankets over the biggest one. That night, I kept the candle off and stayed in bed with the hatchet. I didn't sleep. Every little creak and snap in the woods outside felt louder than ever. I kept imagining that man standing at the edge of the clearing just watching. I knew what I saw. He wasn't a hallucination. That ridge was far. He had to hike up just to stand there and stare down at me. And if he left that fast, he must have been watching already. The next morning, I considered leaving. I even packed my backpack halfway, but the car was parked a ways up the track, and part of me didn't want to feel like I'd been driven out. I still had food and water. I decided to stay one more night, maybe 2, just to see. That evening, I sat on the porch again. I had the hatchet in my lap. It was colder than the other nights. The wind had picked up again, and dark clouds were moving in from the west. Just before sunset, I heard movement in the trees. Not animals, slow, steady footsteps on dry ground. Far off, maybe 30 or 40 meters, I stood and backed into the cabin, locked the door, and waited. The steps went quiet. Then, after maybe 10 minutes, I heard them again, closer this time. I blew out the candle. The cabin was pitch dark except for a sliver of pale light coming through a crack in the window blanket. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at that crack. I saw a shape move across it, just the faintest outline of something passing by. Then I heard the porch steps creak, slowly, one by one. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Whoever it was, they didn't knock. They didn't try to open the door. They just stood there. I could hear the wood creaking under their weight. They were standing right outside the door for a long time. Minutes passed, then more creaks, descending steps, then silence. I stayed awake the whole night. I didn't hear them leave. When the sun finally came up, I opened the door slowly and stepped out. There were faint boot prints in the dirt, leading from the trees to the porch and then looping around the cabin, disappearing back into the woods. Whoever it was had walked the whole perimeter. That was it. I packed everything fast. I was ready to leave immediately. I strapped my bag, took my hatchet, and walked up the track to where my car was parked. When I got there, I found something that froze me cold. Tied to the driver's side mirror with thin twine was a small object, a bundle of sticks, tied tight in the shape of a figure, like a crude doll. It had no face, no markings, just twine and sticks. That was no accident. It wasn't trash or something that blew there. It was placed, tied neatly, meant to be found. I took it off and threw it into the woods. I unlocked the car and left without even checking my mirrors. I didn't stop until I reached a petrol station outside of Cockermouth, where I sat in the car park for an hour. I didn't report it. What would I even say? Some man stared at me from a ridge and left a weird bundle by my car? I never went back. I never contacted the man who rented me the cabin, and I never heard from him either. That whole area is probably still empty, still quiet, still waiting. I sometimes think about that guy on the ridge. The way he stood, how still he was. I don't think he was lost. I don't think he was hiking. I think he was waiting for me, and I'll never know why. I was 32 when I finally bought the kind of land I dreamed about since I was a kid. It was late summer of 2022, and I had been working in construction for almost a decade, saving every cent I could. My parents were gone, and I didn't have any brothers or sisters, no wife, no kids. Just me and a plan. I wanted to be out somewhere quiet, away from the noise and people. Just peace. No more morning traffic. No more secondhand smoke at the bar down the street. No more of the neighbors' music shaking my apartment walls. I was done with all of that. I found a place listed on an old classified site, not one of those big ones. It was buried between some weird listings, people trying to trade goats for used pickups, that kind of stuff. The ad said, 16 acres for sale. Small cabin, full privacy. Great for hunting. Former butcher's land. The price was lower than I expected. Almost too low. The pictures were grainy and old. The cabin looked simple, square, metal roof, old wooden siding. One picture showed a rusted barn in the distance, half hidden by trees. Another was of a long dirt trail running through dry fields. I called the guy the next day. His name was Walter. He was almost 70, used to run a butchering business from a shop in a nearby town. Said he used to hunt, cut meat, live out there on weekends. Said he was getting too old for the place and his kids didn't want it. We met at a diner in Wyoming, just outside a little town called Ralston, and we shook hands on it. Felt like he couldn't get rid of it fast enough. Didn't even want to come with me to the property, just handed me the keys and a folder with the deed. The land was about 30 minutes from any paved road. I drove out in my old Dodge Ram with a camper shell full of gear. It was hot mid-August and dust clung to the windshield. I followed the directions carefully. There was no GPS out there. No cell signal either. Just paper maps and a few scribbled landmarks from Walter. When I finally got there, the cabin looked just like the photos. A square wooden structure, probably 20 by 20 feet. One window in the front, another on the side. The front door was heavy and stiff. I had to put my shoulder into it. Inside it was dark and hot. No power, just a propane stove, an old cot, a wooden table and 2 chairs. There was a weird smell, dry wood, dust and something faintly sour. I thought maybe something died under the floorboards. Mice maybe. Behind the cabin, about 100 yards away, was the barn. It was even more run down. Its roof sagged in the middle. Weeds grew tall around it, and the big sliding door was stuck halfway open. I planned to clean it up later. First, I needed to get the cabin in shape. I spent the first 2 days cleaning. I aired out the place, swept up mouse droppings, patched up gaps in the windows with duct tape and plastic. I set up a battery-powered lantern system I had brought, stocked the cooler with ice and food, and made a little area outside where I could sit and drink coffee in the mornings. On the 3rd day, I started noticing odd things. The first was a small door built into the back wall of the cabin. It was about knee-high like a crawlspace hatch. I hadn't noticed it before, probably because a pile of firewood had been stacked in front of it. I pulled the firewood away and tried opening the door, but it wouldn't budge. The hinges looked rusted shut. I figured it was just storage, maybe old pipes or just empty space under the floor. That night, I heard something moving under the floorboards. It wasn't loud, just a soft scrape, like something dragging or sliding. I thought maybe it was a raccoon or a snake. I stamped my boots on the floor. It stopped. I didn't think much of it, but the next night it happened again. Same time, around 2 a.m., I checked the whole cabin with a flashlight. Nothing. I even walked outside with a shovel and checked the base of the cabin. The foundation was a few cinder blocks and wood skirting. I didn't see anything. The barn was still untouched. I hadn't gone inside yet. I didn't really want to, not until I fixed up the cabin fully. But that night, while I was sitting outside drinking from a bottle of warm water, I thought I saw something move inside the barn. Just a flicker, like someone stepped out of view. There shouldn't have been anyone there. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the barn. The weeds crunched under my boots, and sweat ran down my back. The flashlight beam bounced across rusted tools, broken fence posts, and piles of junk inside the barn. There was no one there, but I noticed something odd. There were deep scratch marks on the inside of the barn's wooden walls. Not fresh, but not that old either. Like someone had taken a knife and dug into the wood. They weren't random either. They were vertical, neat, spaced apart like tall, thin hands had clawed down the walls. I stepped back and saw something else. In the dirt behind one of the wooden crates, there was a pit, maybe 3 feet wide, perfectly round. The dirt had been disturbed. I could see layers of soil like someone had dug recently and then tried to cover it again. I didn't touch it. That night, the noises under the floor came back louder. I didn't sleep. The next day, I pried open that small door inside the cabin. Took almost an hour. I had to use a crowbar and WD-40. When I finally got it open, the smell hit me first, like wet metal and mold. I shined my light inside. It was a narrow space, maybe 2 feet high. Dirt floor. Nothing at first. Then I saw bones. Small ones. Scattered. Some cracked. Some still had dried tendon or fur on them. I pulled back fast and closed the door. I spent the day outside. I didn't even go in to eat. I sat by the truck with the door open, ready to drive off if I saw anything. That night, I locked the cabin door and sat in a chair with my hunting rifle across my lap. I didn't sleep, just listened. At 3:12 a.m., I heard something outside. Not an animal. Footsteps. They were slow, heavy, one after the other, like someone circling the cabin.
I sat frozen.
My hand was sweating on the rifle stock. The steps stopped at the front door. Then I heard scratching. Long, slow scratching. It stopped after a minute.
I waited till morning.
I stepped outside with the rifle. Nothing was there, but the door had long marks across it, like someone had dragged sharp metal across the wood. I walked to the barn again. This time I brought a shovel. I dug into the pit I'd seen behind the crate. It didn't take long. About 2 feet down, I hit something hard. Plastic bag. Inside were bones. Human-sized. Clean. Like someone had boiled the flesh off. There was also something else. An old ID badge, cracked and faded. It belonged to a man named Travis Henson. Date of death was blank. I didn't know who he was. I drove back to town that afternoon. I went to the diner where I'd first met Walter. Asked around. Most people didn't say much, but one guy, older, wore a cowboy hat and spoke slow. Told me something. He said Walter used to hire drifters to help on the land. Said a few had gone missing over the years. Said Walter once had a brother. No one had seen him in decades. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in a motel. The next morning, I drove to the sheriff's office. I didn't tell them everything. Just said I found something strange on my property, human remains, maybe. They sent out a team. They called me a week later. Said the bones were from multiple people. Not all recent. Some old. Some very recent. Said the cabin had a hidden crawl space under the floor, deeper than it looked. Said they found tools down there. Butchering tools. They didn't say much more. I never went back. I sold the land to the state and moved out to Colorado. I live in a small apartment now. Still have the rifle. Still check the locks twice before bed. Sometimes I wake up at 3 a.m. and swear I hear footsteps. But I remind myself I'm not on that farm anymore. That place is someone else's problem now. It was mid-October 2013. I remember the date clearly because I had just turned 31 a week before and decided to spend a few days alone out in the countryside of Northumberland, England. I'd booked a small cabin through a quiet rental site. A local farmer owned it and occasionally rented it out to hikers or anyone who wanted to get away for a bit. It wasn't listed on any big vacation sites or anything like that. The place was tucked about 2 miles off the main road, deep in the hills, surrounded by trees and mist-covered fields.
No neighbors.
No traffic, just peace and quiet. I had been working in London for nearly a decade, most of it behind a desk, and my life had slowly become a blur of office lights, rain, and gray skies. I needed a break from it all, something far from the city. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything like that. I just wanted to hear my own thoughts again without the hum of a bus or some guy yelling into his phone next to me. The cabin was simple, wooden, no frills, just one main room with a bed, a wood stove, a small table, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink and a 2-burner hob. No Wi-Fi, no television, no mobile signal unless you walked up the nearest ridge. The bathroom was a basic outhouse just a short walk down a worn dirt path. There was a water tank on the roof, fed by collected rain and a small pump. I liked it, felt real. It was the kind of place that made you think about how quiet the world used to be. I arrived late in the afternoon. The air smelled like wet leaves and old pine, and the ground was soft with the first signs of autumn rot. I unpacked quickly and lit a fire in the stove, then settled in with a few tins of soup and a bottle of scotch I brought along. That night, I slept deeper than I had in months. The first day passed without anything unusual. I went for a walk, climbed a few of the nearby hills, and took in the view of the valley. In the distance, I could see the gray line of Hadrian's Wall cutting through the landscape like a scar. The weather was calm, cold, but dry, and for most of the day, I didn't see a single person. Just sheep, birds, and the occasional buzzard overhead. The second night is when things changed. It was late, probably near midnight, and I was sitting by the stove reading one of the old paperbacks I'd brought. The wind had picked up, and the cabin creaked a little as the trees swayed outside. I'd gotten used to the sounds by then. Old wood always makes noise, and with wind like that, even rocks seemed to groan. But then I heard something different. Not the wind, not wood. A sharp knock came from the front door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there wasn't a single reason someone should have been out here, especially at that time. No one walks through these hills at night unless they're lost. And even then, who knocks instead of calling out? I stood slowly, my eyes fixed on the door. Another knock, not loud, just strange, deliberate, not rushed, not panicked, almost polite, like someone testing. I didn't say a word. I just stood there listening, my ears strained to pick up any sound beyond the knocking. Footsteps? Breathing? Nothing. After a full minute passed in silence, I moved to the window beside the door and pulled back the curtain just a crack. There was a woman standing there. She was facing the door, not moving.
No bag.
No coat, even though it was freezing. Just a long gray sweater or coat, something knitted, and a pale face. Her hair was dark and flat against her head, wet from the mist, and her hands hung loosely at her sides. She didn't see me looking. Her eyes were fixed on the door, unblinking. I didn't open it. I backed away and sat down by the stove, my mind racing. What was she doing here? Was she in trouble? But something didn't feel right. Everything in me said not to let her in. Not because I thought she was dangerous exactly, but because her presence didn't fit. She wasn't acting like someone desperate or afraid. She just stood there. I waited. 10 minutes, then 20. I checked the window again. Gone. There were no footsteps, no calls into the night, just silence again. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking I heard soft movement outside, like someone brushing against the outer wall or stepping slowly through the leaves. But every time I looked out, there was nothing. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just some hiker who got turned around. Maybe she went to find help elsewhere. I didn't want to obsess over it. I made breakfast, did some writing, and chopped some firewood. But that night, it happened again. Same time, same knock. This time, I didn't go to the window. I just sat there, staring at the door, every hair on my body standing up. I didn't need to look. I knew it was her. Somehow I knew. Same quiet, slow knocking, like she wasn't in any rush, like she was waiting. And again, after several minutes, silence. I waited an hour before I dared open the door. There was no one there, but something was. On the porch, sitting on the edge of the step, was a small stone, perfectly round, almost polished. And next to it, neatly placed, was a single black button, old-looking, with 4 holes. I picked them up. They were cold, too cold, like they'd just come from a freezer. I don't know why I brought them inside. I shouldn't have. That night, I locked the door, shoved the table in front of it, and kept the axe by the stove within arm's reach. I didn't sleep. The following day, I packed my bag. I didn't care that I had 3 more days left in my rental. I wasn't staying. I needed to go. Something about her, whoever she was not right. And the longer I stayed, the more that feeling grew. But when I tried to start the car, it didn't turn over. Battery was dead. I tested it just 2 days before. Everything was fine. But now, nothing. And there was no way I could walk to the main road with all my gear before dark. I decided I'd leave early the next morning, sunrise. I'd take only the essentials and walk. That night, I sat by the stove again, every muscle tense. I kept the axe close and didn't light a fire, didn't want the light to show I was still there. When the knock came, it was louder, harder, not angry, just more certain. She knew I was still here. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat in the dark and waited for her to go. But she didn't. Hours passed. The knocking came and went. Soft, then gone, then soft again. Sometimes it was at the front, then at the window, then, I swear, at the back door near the outhouse. Sometime past 3 in the morning, it stopped. I waited till daylight before moving. When the sun came up, I opened the door and stepped outside, ready to leave. The first thing I saw made my blood run cold. More stones, a circle of them, perfectly placed on the grass in front of the porch. Maybe 20 in all. And inside the circle, more buttons, each one different, old, dirty, torn from coats or jumpers long gone. I walked right through them. I didn't care. I grabbed my bag, left the food and supplies, and walked. I didn't stop until I reached the road, where a passing delivery van gave me a lift into town. When I told the local police officer, an older man who looked like he'd seen more than a few things in his time, he just shook his head slowly and said, "People sometimes go strange out here." He took my statement, but didn't seem like he expected anything to come of it. I left Northumberland the next day, sold the car a week later, never returned. A month after I got back to London, I received a package, no return address, just a plain brown envelope in the post. Inside were 3 things: a button, a stone, and a photo. The photo showed the front of the cabin. My cabin, taken at night, through the window. I was in it, sitting by the stove, staring at the door. It was October 2019. I had just turned 37, and I needed a break from everything: work, people, even my phone. I'd been working as a welder in Tulsa, Oklahoma for almost 16 years, and that kind of work builds up pressure in your head and bones. My back hurt most days, my eyes were getting worse from staring at hot steel, and I hadn't taken a vacation in 3 years. So when my cousin Craig mentioned an old hunting cabin his dad used to take him to up in Montana, I said yes without even thinking. He gave me the general area, somewhere near a dried-up lake bed west of Roundup. The cabin, he said, was old but still standing, tucked in between 2 ridges, about 6 miles off the main dirt road. There weren't any proper trails leading to it anymore, but I figured that was part of the charm. He hadn't been there in a while, but he swore it was still usable. No power, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a cot, and some shelves. I loaded up my old GMC with the basics: rifle, food, sleeping bag, a few jugs of water, and some tools. I brought extra fuel for the stove, and even though it was mid-autumn, I packed some heavy gear. Montana cold doesn't play around. The drive up was long but quiet. By the time I got off the main road and onto the gravel one that snaked into the low mountains, the sun was hanging low. The air smelled dry and sharp, like pine and dust. I passed through a wide patch of prairie before the trees started to thicken. I pulled off when I found a spot that looked like the start of an old logging path and parked the truck behind some thick brush. From there, I hiked the last few miles in. I used a printed topographic map Craig gave me and my compass. The land rolled in long, slow waves, nothing steep, but it all looked the same. It took me nearly 3 hours of slow hiking through dry brush, crunching leaves, and knee-high weeds before I finally saw the roofline of the cabin in the trees. It was nestled tight between 2 small ridges. Trees wrapped around it like hands, and yellow grass spread out around the clearing. The cabin looked tired but solid. The door was a little crooked, and some shingles had slipped off the roof, but it was standing. Inside, it smelled like dry wood, dust, and time. I settled in quickly, dropped my bag unrolled my sleeping gear, checked the stove, opened a couple small windows, and made sure nothing had chewed its way in over the years. There were old tin cans on a shelf, but I didn't touch any of it. I had brought my own supplies. I lit a small fire in the stove, cooked up some canned beans and sausage, and sat on the little stool near the tiny window, just staring out into the woods as the sun dipped. The first night was quiet, except for the usual sounds of woods at night. Light wind, branches creaking, something distant and small walking in the undergrowth now and then. I felt relaxed for the first time in months. I slept like a rock. The next morning, I got up early and went out to scout. I wasn't hunting anything specific, but I had a deer tag, and I brought my .308 just in case. I spent the whole day hiking around the ridges, noting tracks, looking for rubs, and checking tree lines. The land up there was dry but beautiful. Not many people came through, and it showed. No trash, no boot prints, no sign of anyone. Just deer scat, some old elk signs, and birds. But around mid-afternoon, I found something odd. I was circling back around to the cabin from the northwest side of the far ridge when I found what looked like a tiny clearing, like someone had cut a rough path through the trees. The grass there was pressed flat in a square, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and there were boot prints. Not old ones either. Pretty fresh. I crouched and checked them. Definitely not mine. The treads didn't match. They looked like heavy boots, wider than mine too. The strange part was that they didn't lead in any direction. Just a bunch of steps in that square patch and then nothing. No trail leading in, no trail going out. Just prints going in circles, like the guy stood there for a while and walked around. That gave me a weird feeling. It wasn't just that someone else was out there. I expected maybe the occasional hunter. But this wasn't normal. Who walks into the woods and just paces in a perfect square? I marked the spot on the map and got back to the cabin a little earlier than planned. That night, I kept the rifle closer. I didn't sleep as easy. The next day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I chopped some wood, fixed a part of the roof that had started to sag, and walked small loops just past the clearing. I didn't see anyone, but I kept getting the feeling that something was off. At one point, when I was filling a canteen near a small stream, I heard what I thought were faint footsteps up the ridge behind me. But when I turned and climbed up there to look, there was nothing. That evening, I built a small fire outside and sat in the cold with my back to the wall of the cabin, listening. The woods weren't dead quiet, but they felt thinner, like something was off rhythm. I kept looking at the trees across the clearing. At one point, I was sure I saw movement behind a tree. Just for a second, a leg maybe, but when I stood and aimed the rifle, nothing moved. I didn't sleep much that night. On the fourth day, something changed. I woke up to find a dead rabbit nailed to the outside of the doorframe. It was fresh, blood still wet. Its neck had been snapped, and a small wooden stake was hammered right through its front paws into the wall. I didn't panic right away. I told myself maybe some old trapper ritual I didn't understand. Maybe someone marking territory. But I'd been in the woods all my life. I'd hunted in half a dozen states. Nobody does that. That's not a warning. It's a message. I left the rabbit there. I didn't want to touch it. I kept the rifle loaded and by my side the whole day. I didn't go out far. Just circled the cabin slowly every hour. At one point, I heard something knock twice, like a stick hitting a tree not far off, maybe 60 yards. But when I stepped off in that direction, there was nothing there. No movement, no animals, no sound. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't even cook. I sat in the dark by the tiny window, staring into the blackness outside. I barely blinked. Every time the wind shifted, I thought it was footsteps. I could feel it, like I wasn't alone out here. Around midnight, I heard crunching. Leaves and sticks, slow and steady, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything from the window, so I cracked the door slowly and waited, eyes scanning the dark. And then I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette of a man standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing like he'd been there all night. I raised the rifle, aimed, but didn't fire. He didn't move. He didn't run. Just stood there. I shouted, but of course I got no response. Nothing. I shut the door and stayed awake until morning. At dawn, I went outside, rifle ready. The figure was gone. No prints in the clearing.
No trace.
I circled the cabin twice. Nothing. I made up my mind right then. I was leaving. I packed everything fast. Didn't even eat. Just rolled up the bag, doused the stove, and locked the door behind me out of habit. Even though I knew it didn't matter. I moved fast. Didn't follow the same trail out either. I cut through a different part of the woods, climbed down a slope, and followed the stream bed until I hit the road. When I got back to my truck, there were fresh boot prints in the dirt around it. Big ones. Same tread as before. My passenger door was unlocked. I hadn't left it that way. I checked the glove box, checked under the seat. Nothing missing, nothing added. But someone had been in there. I could feel it, like someone had just sat inside and looked around. I drove out without stopping. I didn't look in the rear view more than I had to. I got to the first gas station, filled up, and sat there for almost 20 minutes, just thinking. I didn't call anyone, didn't tell Craig. I just went home and went back to work. It's been years now, but I still think about that man in the woods, about those boot prints and the rabbit on the wall. I don't know what he wanted, or if he wanted anything, but I know what I felt. I wasn't welcome there, and I'm never going back. My name is Jason Lowery, and this happened back in late October 2017. I was 35 at the time and had just left a maintenance job I'd been working in northern Arkansas. I was tired of the noise and stress. I'd been saving for years and finally bought a 4-acre piece of wooded land in a remote corner of Tennessee, outside a dying town called Fairwood. The plan was to build a simple off-grid cabin by hand, live out there for a few months, and clear my head. It was supposed to be peaceful. I had everything ready. The land had been surveyed. I'd hauled tools and supplies there slowly over a few weeks: generator, chainsaw, bags of concrete, cinder blocks, tarps, nails, 2x4s, insulation panels, windows, even a wood-burning stove. I kept most of the stuff locked in a rusting shipping container I'd bought off Craigslist and dragged out there on a trailer with the help of a friend from my old job. I chose a build spot about 50 yards back from the gravel drive, right between a tall tree line and a gentle dip that caught water runoff when it rained. The slope was good dry, shaded, with a little view of a clearing ahead. I'd already poured the small footing for the pier blocks and laid out the string lines. The problem was I pushed my schedule too far. I wanted the floor framed before the weekend because the forecast said heavy storms were moving in. But I lost 2 days dealing with a flat tire and a bad alternator. So instead of waiting out the rain like a sane person, I told myself I could at least frame and sheath the floor before nightfall, even if it was already drizzling when I pulled up that Thursday afternoon. It was stupid in hindsight, but I didn't want to lose another day. I had the tools loaded in the bed of my truck, a thermos of coffee, my rain jacket, and a headlamp. I figured I'd work into the early night, cover the floor with a tarp, and sleep in the truck if I had to. By the time I started unloading the treated lumber, the rain had picked up, came in slow at first, then turned steady and cold. It soaked my sleeves fast. The clouds were hanging low, dark and heavy, and the woods around me were thick with that quiet tension that comes before a real storm. I ran the generator under a tarp strung between 2 trees and worked fast, cutting the rim joists, squaring them, nailing them down to the piers. The ground squelched when I stepped. Rainwater ran in small rivers between the stones. I kept my boots on a pile of spare OSB when I could, but my socks were soaked within an hour. As I nailed the subfloor down, thick sheets of tongue and groove plywood, the light dropped fast. I threw on the headlamp and kept hammering. I was freezing and sweating at the same time, kneeling in the rain, knees soaked and aching. I wasn't thinking about anything except getting the floor sealed up. That was until I started to hear things. Started around 8 p.m., I think. I just stood up from hammering the last nail into the plywood when I heard what sounded like a branch snapping in the woods. Came from the right, maybe 20 yards into the trees. At first, I thought nothing of it. The woods creak and pop in the rain. But then it came again, louder. Not a natural crack. More like something solid, like a boot heel stepping hard on a fallen stick. I froze, listening. Rain pattered on the hood of my jacket. My breath was loud in my ears. Nothing. I clicked off the headlamp for a second, hoping my eyes would adjust and I could catch movement if anything was out there. I saw nothing, just the faint outlines of trees, all black and swaying. I stood still for maybe 30 seconds, trying to slow my breathing. Then I clicked the light back on and got back to work. But my hands were colder now, slower. I started glancing into the woods every few minutes. Around 8:30, it started again. Not the snap this time, but a shuffling sound. And this time, it wasn't on the right. Came from behind me, near the gravel road where I'd parked my truck. I turned fast and aimed the beam of my light. I saw nothing again, but I stood for a long time staring toward the truck. The red glow from the tail lights reflected in the wet gravel. I scanned the woods left to right and saw nothing. Still, I walked over and double-checked that the cab was locked. Something about the silence didn't feel right. I've camped in rain before, but the woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, just steady rain, and me standing there soaked to the bone. I wanted to leave, but I told myself maybe it was a raccoon or a deer moving through the brush. Maybe my nerves were on edge from the cold and the dark. So I told myself I'd finish what I started. Just roll out the tarp over the subfloor and call it a night. I walked back to the cabin frame and bent down to grab the tarp from a plastic bin. I had it halfway unfolded when I felt something that made my stomach drop. The air behind me shifted, like something moved through it. I turned around, fast. Still nothing. But then I noticed something that I hadn't seen before. A small pile of wet leaves at the edge of the subfloor, freshly disturbed. The dirt was smeared, not by rain, but by something that had stepped there. I leaned closer and saw what looked like a partial boot print in the soft mud. Not mine. It was smaller, maybe a size 9. I wear 12. I backed up slowly. There was no one supposed to be out here. This land was private. I hadn't told anyone where I'd be tonight. I hadn't seen another car on the back road coming in, and it was pouring rain. Who the hell would be walking through the woods at night in this weather? I left the tarp on the subfloor and walked fast back to the truck, heart pounding. I unlocked the door, climbed in, and slammed it shut, locked it again. The windows were fogged from my breathing. I wiped the inside of the glass and stared out through the rain. I sat there for a long time, just listening. Then, as I reached toward the ignition to start the engine, my headlights blinked. Not turned on, they blinked. Just once. I didn't touch the switch. I stared at the switch on the column. My hand hadn't been near it. I turned the key partway, the dash lit up. Headlights stayed off. I turned the switch manually. They came on. I flipped them off again. Everything worked normal. I don't know if it was a short or a moisture issue or something else, but it felt wrong, like someone had done it. I sat there a long time, engine off, heart thudding in my chest. Then something moved at the tree line. It was just at the edge of the headlights, a figure, just standing there in the rain. I snapped my eyes toward it. My breath caught, but in that second, it stepped back into the dark, behind the trees, out of view. I didn't wait. I started the truck and backed out fast down the gravel, nearly sliding on the wet rocks. My tires kicked up water and mud. I didn't stop driving until I was 2 miles out on the paved road, windows fogged, wipers going, heart still racing. I parked under a gas station canopy 15 minutes later and sat there for an hour with the heater on full blast, gripping the wheel, watching the rain. I didn't tell anyone. Not then. The next day, I drove back with the sun out and a hunting rifle across the passenger seat. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. But I found more boot prints in the mud around the cabin site. Same size, same tread. They circled the subfloor. They went around the generator and the lumber pile. They walked to the back of the truck and stood there for a while. I counted maybe 6 full prints, all pointing in different directions. And I found a cigarette, but in the mud behind a tree. Still fresh, like it had been dropped that night. I packed up all the tools I could carry and drove back to Little Rock that evening. I listed the land 2 weeks later. Sold it a month after that. I never went back. I don't know who was out there in the woods that night, but they weren't lost. They weren't drunk or looking for help. They were watching me, in the dark, in the rain, silent and close. And they wanted me to know they were there. It was the summer of 2019. I had just turned 29, and after getting laid off from a construction job in Portland, I decided to take a break from everything. No phone, no work, no traffic, just me, my backpack, and the woods. I drove my old silver Subaru Outback out toward a remote patch of forest near a town called Maupin in central Oregon. I had found it marked on an old topographical map I bought from a used bookstore a few months earlier. The area was mostly uninhabited, miles from the nearest trailhead, and as far as I could tell, almost completely forgotten. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked on a rough gravel shoulder beside a narrow service road that looked like it hadn't been used in years. From there, I hiked deep into the forest, following faint deer paths and dry stream beds. My plan was to camp under the stars for 2 nights and just reset. I had a tent, some MREs, a portable water filter, and an emergency beacon clipped to my pack. It all felt pretty simple. By the afternoon of the first day, I had hiked farther than expected and ended up climbing a long, slow ridge through thick timber. When I finally reached the top, sweaty and tired, I looked down into a small, hidden valley covered in dark pine and surrounded by crumbling basalt rock. That's when I saw it. The cabin. It was barely visible between the trees. A shape that didn't belong. Faded gray siding. A rusted metal roof partially caved in. No path led to it. No road, no drive, nothing. Just an old structure swallowed by the forest. I should have just walked past. But I didn't. I pushed through brush and dead branches, walked down the slope, and stood in front of it. The whole place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. One side of the porch had collapsed under the weight of years. The front door was hanging open, one hinge still barely holding on. Tall grass and moss grew up around the foundation, and the glass in all the windows had been long since shattered. Out of curiosity, and maybe a little hunger, I stepped inside. The air inside was thick with that old wood smell, damp and sour. Dust covered everything. There was a table, a stove that looked like it hadn't worked since the 60s, and a narrow cot shoved into one corner. Torn curtains still hung from rusted nails beside the windows. It was clear nobody had been here for a long time. I set my bag down and explored a bit. The back room was just storage, rusty tools, a couple empty metal gas cans, and what looked like mouse-chewed blankets. The roof above the kitchen was partially caved in, letting in a shaft of sunlight that made the floating dust look almost frozen in the air. Something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off. Still, it was already late afternoon. I figured it was better to sleep under a roof than outside. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, ate one of the MREs, and used my filter to fill up water from a stream I had passed on the hike in. I kept the emergency beacon close. That night, I barely slept. Not because of any sounds or animals. It was the silence that got me. Usually, the woods are alive at night. Crickets, wind, leaves. But around that cabin, once the sun dipped below the ridge, everything went dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I laid there in my bag, staring at the rotted wood beams above me, barely blinking. I don't remember when I finally fell asleep, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, not from a dream, not from a noise, just wide awake, like someone had snapped their fingers right next to my ear. The room was completely dark except for the faint moonlight seeping in through a crack in the roof. I didn't move at first. I just laid there and tried to figure out what had woken me. That's when I heard it. A soft, distinct creak. Floorboards, not loud, but slow and drawn out. Then silence. I stayed frozen. I couldn't tell if it had come from the cabin or outside. Maybe an animal, I told myself. Maybe the wood was settling. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't either of those things. Another creak. This time closer. I sat up slowly and reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark and lit up the table and the empty chairs around it. Nothing there. I stood up, moved the light toward the open doorway. Still nothing. But my stomach sank when I saw fresh dirt on the floor. Small pieces of debris, almost like someone had just stepped inside and tracked it in. I held still, didn't breathe. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I aimed the flashlight toward the back room, slowly walked across the cabin, each step as quiet as I could manage. I looked into the storage room, empty. I checked outside next, stepped onto the soft ground, sweeping the flashlight in a wide arc around the front yard. Nothing but trees and night. But then I saw them. Footprints. Bare ones. They weren't mine. I had been wearing boots. These were smaller, wider, bare feet. Not animal. Human. And they led from the treeline to the cabin. I felt like my skin was being pulled tight over my bones. I wanted to run. I should have. But instead, I backed slowly inside, shut the door the best I could, and shoved one of the old chairs under the handle. Then I sat there, fully dressed, back against the wall, flashlight on my lap, and waited for the sun to come up. I must have dozed off again near dawn. When I opened my eyes, everything was pale and quiet. No sign of anyone or anything, but the footprints were still there, and one more had appeared just outside the doorway, facing the cabin. I packed up my gear in under 2 minutes, grabbed the beacon, didn't eat, didn't drink. I just left. I hiked fast, faster than I should have. The terrain was rough and steep, but I didn't care. I only stopped once, halfway back to the road, to throw up. I was that shaken. When I finally reached my car, I threw my bag in the back, locked the doors, and drove until I saw power lines and gas stations again. I didn't sleep properly for 3 days after that. I tried to rationalize it later. Maybe it was just a homeless person living deep in the woods. Maybe a hunter. Maybe a squatter. But there was no gear. No signs of anyone living there. No food.
No bags.
Nothing but that cabin, those footprints, and the silence. I've never gone back to that part of Oregon. I don't even look at maps of it anymore. And whenever I go hiking now, I always sleep in my tent. I don't care how sturdy a roof looks. I don't care how cold it gets. Because sometimes a roof is the last thing you want over your head. My name is Adam West. I'm 34 years old. It was late autumn in 2018 when this happened. I still think about it more often than I should. I had been working with Crown Security Services for a little over 5 years by then. My sir, that's what we all called him, was Roy Mendez, ex-British military, bald head, square jaw, Always wore a black jacket even in the summer. He wasn't the kind of guy you asked questions. You just followed instructions. That's what we did when we got the call about a surveillance job out in Montana. Middle of nowhere. A small wooden cabin in the woods, near the Bitterroot Valley. Our target was a man named Franklin Kessler. Not a criminal in the usual sense. He had once been part of some high-level finance firm. Then he dropped off the grid completely 2 years earlier. Rumor was he was holding on to some digital assets, crypto maybe, something that made some rich people very nervous. We weren't there to arrest him. We were there to watch. Sir Roy picked me for the job. It was supposed to be a quiet solo assignment, low contact. Set up surveillance, monitor activity, report back. 2 weeks tops. I accepted without asking much. I flew into Missoula and drove an old pickup up into the mountains. After about 4 hours on the dirt roads, I reached the location. The cabin sat in a shallow dip in the woods, shielded from the road by a line of spruce trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged, moss crawled up the wood, and rust flaked off the window screens. I set up a blind spot on a small ridge behind the place, tucked into a camouflage tent, 50 yards back. The only power came from a deep cycle battery I brought along, just enough to keep my laptop, small heater, and cameras running. First, it was boring. Kessler barely left the cabin. I caught glimpses of him through the windows sometimes. Tall, thin, moved like a man used to big city sidewalks. He spent most of his time at a table near the front window, writing in a notebook or staring into a monitor. No internet lines out there, no phone signal either. Whatever he was doing it offline. I logged everything. Movement times, lights on or off, notes about his mood. It was all routine. The third night, things started to feel off. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a sharp click. I thought it might have been the heater at first, but then I heard another sound like someone walking slowly over damp leaves. Not rushing, careful. I sat up, heart pushing hard, and slowly unzipped the tent flap. The air was cold, sharp. I couldn't see anything. Everything looked like shadows. But the noise came again. Just one footstep, then silence. The trees didn't move. No wind.
No birds.
That kind of silence always meant something. I stayed still for almost an hour. No more noise came. I told myself it was probably an animal, but I knew better. I've been on these kinds of jobs long enough to tell the difference between a coyote and a man. The next morning, I checked my motion-activated camera at the perimeter. One of them had been moved, not knocked over, moved. It was a subtle difference, tilted just slightly, but enough to ruin the angle. I didn't report it. I didn't want to sound jumpy. I just made notes, adjusted the angle, and set up a second hidden cam a little farther back. By the fifth night, my nerves were running hot. I hadn't slept more than a couple hours straight. The feeling that I was being watched wouldn't go away. It was like a tightness in my chest every time the sun dipped behind the ridge. I watched Kessler that night from the hill again. He hadn't left the cabin in 2 days. He moved less, ate less. I could see trash piling up inside. He was hunched more. The longer I looked at him, the more I noticed something strange. He never looked toward the woods. Not once. Not even out the back window. It was like he was afraid to see something. That's when I realized he had his own cameras. Small black ones, barely visible from my side. They were pointed outward, one at the front path, one at the back door, one on the ridge. Right where I was. I froze. Had he seen me already? Was this whole thing a trap? I ducked down and stayed low the rest of the night. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I waited until late morning to circle the cabin on foot. I stayed wide, maybe 100 yards out, and watched from the trees. I saw the cameras. Definitely not standard home security. These were black, low profile, pro level. He wasn't hiding from people. He was watching for someone, maybe expecting them. That evening, I emailed a coded message to Sir Roy from the satellite laptop. Just said, "Target shows signs of counter-surveillance. Need guidance." I didn't get a reply. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, they came from the cabin direction. Then they stopped about 20 yards from me. Nothing else.
No breathing. No coughing.
Just a stop. I held my knife ready all night, barely blinking. No sleep again. When daylight finally came, I crawled out and searched the area. That's when I found the boot print. Not mine, not Kessler's. Way too wide and short, almost square, deep, heavy, fresh. There was only one. I snapped a photo and backed off. That was the moment the mission flipped in my head. I wasn't observing anymore. I was part of something I didn't understand. I packed my gear and moved the blind to a new location farther up the hill. I kept the lens on the cabin but made sure I had a better line of escape. 2 more days passed. No sign of Sir Roy. No email.
No backup.
Then, on the 9th night, Kessler ran. I watched him sprint out the front door around 2 a.m., barefoot, holding nothing. He didn't even lock the place. Just bolted straight into the woods toward the highway. I almost went after him, but something told me to stay put. 10 minutes later, a truck pulled up. Black, no plates. 3 men got out. Big, military posture. Not police, not FBI. One of them had a long object under a blanket, probably a rifle. They entered the cabin without knocking.
No hesitation.
I stayed low, camera zoomed in. They moved fast inside, tossed furniture, checked under the floorboards. One of them took the hard drive from the desk. Another one smashed the laptop. None of them looked for Kessler. They weren't worried about him. They were worried about what he left behind. The third guy stepped out onto the porch and looked straight at my ridge, right at me. I dropped down and shut everything. No movement, no light. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I didn't move until they left 40 minutes later. They didn't find me, but they knew someone had been watching. I waited another 2 hours, packed up what I could carry, and hiked 3 miles up into a clearing. Buried the SD cards, smashed the backup drive, wiped everything else. I left the rest. Tent, gear, heaters, all of it. I hiked back toward the road and caught a ride into town from a passing log truck driver. I didn't go back to Crown. I changed my number, cut my hair, moved to Oregon under a new name. It's been almost 7 years. I keep a simple life now. Work as a landscaper, pay in cash. I don't talk to anyone about what happened. But here's the thing that sticks with me more than anything. Kessler wasn't hiding from us. He wasn't hiding from the government. He was hiding from those men, or men like them. And Sir Roy never contacted me again. Not once. I think he knew what I walked into and left me out there. Maybe to test me. Maybe because I knew too much already. I still wonder who those men were. I still think about the boot print, why there was only one. I still think about Kessler's face as he ran. No fear, just desperation. And sometimes, late at night, I feel like someone's still watching me. Maybe I was never supposed to come back, but I did, and I'll never take a job like that again. It was September of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything and spend some time alone in a cabin I'd been building slowly over the past 3 years. It was nothing fancy, just a single-room wood cabin tucked away deep in the Huron-Manistee National Forest in northern Michigan. I was 33 years old, working as a welder in Grand Rapids, but I'd grown up out in the country. Solitude didn't bother me. In fact, I needed it. My relationship had ended the month before, and I'd been working long hours ever since. I figured a week in the woods, alone with my thoughts, might help clear my head. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water. It was built on a small clearing maybe a quarter-mile from a creek. I'd made it tall and strong, with thick pine walls and a heavy front door that I repurposed from an old barn. I brought everything I'd need: cans of food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, 2 good flashlights, a hunting knife, a .308 rifle, and a basic battery-powered radio for weather updates. No cell reception out there, which was exactly how I wanted it. The first 2 days were quiet and peaceful. I spent my time chopping firewood, fishing a little, walking the trails near the creek, and just sitting on the porch watching the sun go down through the trees. The air was clean and cold in the mornings, and crisp in the afternoons. Fall was coming in slow but steady. Leaves were turning and falling. Deer tracks crisscrossed the area near my outhouse, and one morning I saw a fox dart between the trees not 20 feet from where I was sitting. On the 3rd day, something felt off. I woke up around 6 in the morning and stepped outside to relieve myself. The forest felt still, but not in the usual way. There were no birds, no wind, just dead silence. I'd noticed before how quiet the forest could be, but this felt different, heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. I walked a slow circle around the cabin, just checking things out. My axe was still stuck in the stump out front. Firewood stack looked fine. No signs of animals or anything disturbed. I brushed it off and figured it was just me overthinking. I warmed up a can of beans on the stove, ate, then headed down to the creek to fill up my water filter. That's when I noticed the boot prints. They weren't mine. I was wearing hiking boots, and my tread was different. These were longer, thinner, and had worn down heels. I knelt down and studied them. They led from the creek toward the woods, not toward the trail I'd used, but deeper into the trees on the opposite side. They looked fresh, maybe made early that morning or late the night before. I felt a bit of tension in my chest, but I tried to calm myself. Could be a hunter or a hiker. The forest was public land after all. Still, I didn't hear or see anyone nearby, and the direction of the prints didn't make much sense. They weren't following any path. They just drifted into the trees. I filtered the water quickly and walked back to the cabin, keeping my head on a swivel. That night, I kept the rifle close. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard a twig snap outside. Then nothing. I stayed still under the sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening hard. No wind.
No owls.
Just stillness. I finally drifted off again near dawn. In the morning, I walked around the cabin again. Found nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept thinking about those prints. Why were they headed in that direction? No trail.
No campsites.
Just woods. And why hadn't I heard anyone? That evening, I set up a tripwire with an old tin can about 10 feet from the front porch, across the narrow trail that led into the woods. It wasn't anything fancy, just a string tied low with the can hanging from it, but I figured it might give me a little warning if someone, or something, walked by. It was near midnight when I woke up again. No sound, just a feeling in my gut. I sat up and held my breath. Then I heard the can. It rattled, lightly then harder, like someone brushed it, paused, and then touched it again. I grabbed my flashlight and the rifle, stepped quietly to the door, and opened it just a crack. My heart was hammering in my chest. I shined the light into the trees, sweeping back and forth. Nothing, but the can was gone. The string was still tied to the tree, but the can that had been hanging from it was missing. I walked over slowly, scanning the ground. Nothing but leaves.
No footsteps.
No sign of movement. I stood there for a long time, light and rifle up, just watching the dark woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Next morning, I searched the area around the cabin again. This time, I found something new. It was a pile of stones, about 20 feet into the woods. Small, flat rocks stacked into a little pyramid. 4 stones at the bottom, then 3, then 2, and 1 on top. It looked deliberate, human-made. I'd never seen that before. I didn't touch it. I didn't even go close. I backed away slowly, looking around. I stayed inside most of the day after that, door locked, rifle ready. I was starting to think I wasn't alone out there. Someone else was in the woods watching, maybe more than one person, and they weren't trying to say hello. I couldn't explain the can, or the boot prints, or the stacked rocks, but my instincts were screaming now, and I'd learned long ago to trust them. That night I didn't sleep. At one point, I turned the lantern off completely and just listened in the dark. I heard movement outside, slow, deliberate steps, not an animal. It circled the cabin once, then silence, then again. I stayed still, rifle in my arms, trying not to breathe too loud. The next morning, I decided I wasn't gonna wait around and see what happened next. I packed everything fast, didn't bother with breakfast, just got my gear and started hiking out. The nearest parking area was about 5 miles south, along a dirt service road. It was rough terrain. I had to move quick and quiet, staying off the main trail. Every 20 minutes I stopped and listened. I thought I heard something behind me a few times. A snap, a shuffle, but I couldn't be sure. When I finally reached my truck, it was almost sunset. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. I threw my pack in the back and got in fast. Started the engine and didn't stop until I hit paved road again. I didn't report anything. What would I say? Someone messed with a can and stacked some rocks? I haven't been back since. 2 months later, I talked to a guy at a hunting supply store who knew that part of the forest. I didn't tell him everything, just mentioned I used to camp up there. He gave me a strange look and said, "That stretch has always been weird. Lot of missing hikers up there. Some don't get reported. Locals avoid it." I asked him what he meant by that, but he just shrugged and changed the subject. It's been years now. I still think about it. The boot prints, the stones, the can, and the fact that someone was close enough to take it without me ever seeing them. I don't think it was random. I think whoever was out there saw me when I didn't see them. Maybe they were just playing games, or maybe they were waiting for something. I'm not going back to find out. My name's Cole Bennett. I was 41 at the time this happened. It was late October 2022. I live in northern Idaho, near Grangeville. I'd been working construction since I was in my early 20s, but that year had been slow. Projects had dried up, and my truck had been giving me issues, so I took some time off. I figured I'd clear my head, get away from the phone, and take a short break with my dog, Mason. He's a 7-year-old black lab with more energy than he knows what to do with. He'd been cooped up all summer with the heat, and I owed it to him. I'd heard about this old place in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness from a friend of mine. It wasn't on any official campground map. The place was a small cabin, supposedly built in the 70s by a guy who ran hunting tours but passed away years back. It was tucked into a gorge near a dried-out riverbed that only really flowed heavy in the spring. I looked it up on some hiking forums and pieced together a rough idea of where it was, about 4 miles off the Forest Service Road, buried under pines and maples. The idea sounded perfect, quiet, no people, and a solid hike. I packed light. Sleeping bag, small stove, food, water, bear spray, hunting knife, and some extra clothes. I also brought a tarp in case the roof of the place wasn't in good shape. My old Remington 870 came with me too, just for safety. I didn't plan to hunt, but it gave me peace of mind. I loaded Mason into the truck and hit the dirt roads. It was about a 2-hour drive from my place. The trail that led into the gorge wasn't marked, just a game path really narrow and overgrown. I parked off the road, locked the truck, and headed in. The hike was harder than I expected. Lots of loose rock and downed trees. I had to stop and adjust my pack a few times. Mason was doing laps, darting between bushes, nose to the ground like he was on a mission. By the time we got to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was dropping behind the ridgeline, and the air was already cooling fast. The place looked exactly like something out of a forgotten hunting magazine. Logs stacked with moss growing between the cracks, the roof sagging in places, and a rusted stovepipe barely poking out the top. It sat on a small ridge above the riverbed, surrounded by thick woods. There was a fire ring out front, mostly rocks and blackened logs, and an old bench made from a split tree trunk. No one had been there in years, but there were no signs of damage, no graffiti or trash, which made me feel a bit better about staying the night. I did a quick check inside. The door creaked bad but still closed tight. The interior was musty, but solid. 2 small cots, a table, shelves with old cans of beans and soup probably older than I was. There was even a wood stove, though I doubted the chimney was clear. I didn't risk using it. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the cleaner of the 2 cots and laid out Mason's pad on the floor next to me. I boiled some water on my camping stove and ate a pouch of chicken and rice while Mason crunched down his dry food. The sun dipped fully by 6, and the shadows from the trees reached far across the ground. The gorge got real dark, real fast. No cell service out there. No sounds except the wind through the leaves and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere out in the forest. I wasn't nervous, not yet. I'd camped plenty before, but I kept the shotgun leaned against the wall next to me and made sure my headlamp had fresh batteries. Mason was restless, though. He usually settles down after dinner, but he kept pacing the room, sniffing the cracks under the door and windows. I figured maybe some animals had passed through earlier, elk or maybe a bear. It was late in the season for bears, but not impossible. I gave him a quick check and didn't see anything wrong. Around 9, I shut off the lamp and got into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep more than 30 minutes before Mason started growling. It wasn't loud, not a bark, just a low growl in his throat, like he was unsure about something. I sat up slowly and switched on the lamp. His eyes were fixed on the window. I walked over, careful not to make noise, and peeked out. Nothing, just trees and the empty dark. But his hackles were up. I checked the door, still locked. I stood there, listening. The wind had died down. I couldn't hear anything. I turned off the lamp again and laid back down, but I didn't fall asleep. I just watched the ceiling, hearing every creak, every leaf falling outside. At some point after midnight, I heard something. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a branch falling. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the leaves outside the cabin. Mason sat up again, silent now but rigid. I grabbed the shotgun without making a sound and stood by the wall, straining to hear more. The steps moved around the cabin just outside, then stopped near the back wall. I stayed perfectly still. Mason didn't bark. He didn't even growl. He just stared at the wall like he knew something was on the other side. I waited maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps this time. Something brushing against the back wall. Not claws, not scratching, more like fabric. Like someone brushing up against it. I clicked off the safety. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. No one should be out here. I hadn't seen a single car or track on the way in. I hadn't seen any signs of recent use. It was cold, pitch dark, and the path to the cabin was tough even in daylight. There was a knock, not on the door, on the side wall. 1, 2, 3 quick taps, then silence. Mason started growling again. I didn't move. My eyes adjusted as best they could. I waited, hoping it was just an animal, maybe something leaning against the wall, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I don't know how, but I knew someone was out there. I kept the shotgun aimed at the door in case it opened. The knocks didn't come again, but I couldn't sleep. I stood there, waiting, until the sun finally started to lighten the trees. I stepped outside as soon as I could see well enough. The ground was undisturbed, no tracks, No marks on the cabin. I checked the back wall, nothing. But Mason kept sniffing the spot where the knocks came from. I stayed another hour just making sure it was clear, but I knew I wasn't staying a second night.
I packet fast.
Mason didn't leave my side. He wasn't running around like before. He stuck close, tail low. The hike back to the truck felt longer. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every little sound made me freeze. We made it back to the road by late morning, and I drove straight home. That night, I locked every door and window. I kept the shotgun by the bed. I told myself maybe it was a hunter who got lost, or a backpacker looking for shelter. But I knew better. There's no reason to knock if you're lost in the woods. And there's no reason to walk around a cabin at midnight in freezing temperatures without saying a word. I haven't gone back to that area since. Mason still gets weird when we walk near thick woods, and I've learned to trust his instincts a lot more. That night reminded me that some parts of the forest don't want company. Not because of anything supernatural, not because of ghosts or legends, just because someone out there might already be watching, and they don't always want to be seen.